Okay, so I'm going to follow on very much from Asun. I actually work as well in the LEADER project, and in the Falcon project, we're really exploring how far can we take some of these ideas of linked data and linguistic linked data, but drilling down and really seeing what are the pros and cons, the challenges we face, applying it in a very specific industry sector, in particular localization and the use of language technology in localization, which is why I think is very relevant for this session here. So I'm not going to talk about language resource interoperability in general. I'm going to talk very specifically in that particular use case. So if we hear a lot about big data and the big data value chain. We're also hearing now about the multilingual data value chain. And I think one of the words that it isn't addressed a lot, we hear a lot about it's got to be big. And I think, as if you're very right, the more data you have, the more you can do with it. But I think you also pointed out that it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think one of the things we really have to understand is not just how much data we have, but where exactly does the value lie in that data? So where does it lie? So who creates that value? Who owns it? Who needs it? If you can answer those questions, then the job of sharing resources, encouraging people to publish resources, perhaps even establishing a market in resources can become a lot clearer because people understand the value that they get out of using language resources. So in localization, we understand that very well. Before the advent of language technology, statistical language technology, we understood that very well. I always argue localization has been a big data industry for a very long time. It's an industry that monetizes data. Words are our data. We have translation memories, we have term bases, and those are traded on a daily basis in the sense that clients requesting translation jobs negotiate discounts on the fact that they've got existing language resources, primarily in translation memories, but also term bases. So we understand how that improves the productivity of translating and post-editing. It tends to only really work very well within the scope of an existing client within a chain of content for that particular client. But the fact that we understood that value meant then a whole range of tools evolved around that value. We understood the value of that data. It was traded. It had a commercial impact. So then everything else that we discussed in terms of linked data happened with translation memories. People developed tools to help manage that value. Now we're in a world where we're trying to apply language technology and trying to understand the productivity improvements that we get from using language technology through the reuse of language resources. And I use the word language technology in a slightly broader sense than just machine translation, because I think obviously statistical machine translation is what we're focused on with the automated translation area. But there are other aspects of language technology that are important in localization, like automatic text extraction, perhaps word sense disambiguation, etc. These are things that can help translators and translation companies become more productive. Okay, so there's a monetary and a value aspect there. So what's important is to understand where that value lies and how can we help, or can we use open data and open linked data and linguistic linked data to really leverage that value. So if we look at look at an example. So this is some DG, some European Union documents. It's stuff that has been published, and the translation memories from these have been published as part of the DGT translation memory output. Okay, so you can look at that and say, well, okay, you've got two places on the web where you've got translations. We know, well, we trust, but we're fairly confident that these are high quality translations. If we would just go on the web and look at these pages, we'd have to do a lot of work to try and align these to make them useful for machine translation. But the fantastic thing with DGT is that they actually keep the alignments they've done as translation memory, make that freely available for us. Okay, so we already have some value that is being added to the work that's done by publishing those translation memories, and we're very familiar with that in the translation business, which is why translation memories are the most downloaded data from the EC Open Data Portal, because there's a lot of people who understand the value of those. Equally with terminology. Again, the Eurovoc data is the third most downloaded data from the European Open Data Portal, and that's again because there are a lot of people out there who understand the value, the time that they save by using terminology. So in that segment that I highlighted earlier, it talks about production capacity, and that's been selected by the people at DGT, say, well, this is a term that comes up a lot. We put it in our term base, and we provide additional value information about it. We provide some taxonomical information about this, relating it to other more general or more specific products. And we also provide translations for that term, okay? And what's important here is that we're dealing with what we regard as multi-word units. So these are things that, if they're translated, should be translated as a whole, like not necessarily accurately translated by addressing the two words separately. So again, the European Commission is providing additional value by making this data available. But currently, if you want to see where that relates to the translation memories, you actually have to do that yourself. There's no record absolutely of which terms were used in which parts of the document and which parts of the translation memory. So there's some value there, but there could be a little bit more if that link was made available. Then take it a bit further in terms of how can we use different types of language technology. So one thing that we're looking at in Falcon, saying, okay, we can get some sense of using an existing term base to make sure we have certain translations done accurately, but we want to, before we undertake machine translation of content, we want to say, are there other terms where we can mine the translation, especially for multi-word units? So we can use the services BabelFi and the resource BabelNet, that again you've probably heard a lot about over the last few days, which has aggregated a lot of lexical information across many languages, many hundreds of languages, many millions and millions of resources there. That enables a service that we can put in sentences and get annotations about the words, and it does a fairly good job because it is based on a lot of not just lexical information, but encyclopedic information. It does a fairly good job of identifying things like multi-word units. So it identifies production capacity, okay? And actually, if you drill down, you follow the links, it gives you a definition and it gives you a translation. That translation is actually the same as the translation that Eurovoc has. And I have to ask Roberto whether that's coincidence or whether it's because they've imported that resource already. I know that's something they're currently working on. But those resources also come from other places like Wiktionary and Wikipedia. So that could be confirmatory that that is a term, it's a multi-word unit, and it should be translated as a multi-word unit in a certain way. But we can also look further on that sentence. It's talking about particular white goods, chest freezers and microwave ovens. These aren't things that are in Eurovoc. They're not things that the EU has decided they need to establish as terminology. It probably doesn't come up that frequently. But still, BabelNet, which covers a much wider domain, is able to identify them as multi-word units, be able to point us to additional information, including pictures, definitions, sometimes even pronunciation guides. So for translators, this is really invaluable information. But again, when you drill down in this case, if you click on chest freezer, it actually takes you to an entry that addresses the more general topic of refrigerator, icebox, fridge. So chest freezer being a particular individual type of that, subtype of that. So that's useful information if you didn't know what a chest freezer was. It narrows it down a bit, but it's not like the phrase production capacity where it tells you exactly how it should be, translated. And if you're getting these two things mixed up, well, then that's sort of a big deal. If you order a chest freezer on the internet and you get a refrigerator delivered, you're not going to be very happy about that. And that might be the sort of thing that will come up in the sort of commercial dispute resolution service, for example, that we get those terms exactly right. So we see that there's some help that these resources can offer us, but we still need human validation and human expertise to identify where it's not quite specific enough, or perhaps even where it's getting something wrong. So again, we can look at this. We can say, okay, there's some French translations of different types of refrigerators, icebox, etc. If we took one of those and put it into a machine translation, is that going to give us a good result or a bad result? Certainly we would need to check that. We would need to look at that in part of the post-editing process. So if we revisit that question of where does the value lie, obviously there is value that is well established in parallel text and in terminology. But what we're finding with the work in Falcon and collaborating with Leader is there is also value in the links that we can form between them. So if we look at the process that we might take using these technologies, so we start with this sentence. Localization, the first thing we do is we extract and we segment it. We divide it up into sentences. Then we can go through that and annotate it, say, okay, where are there existing terms? We saw that example, production capacity. We know that's a term. We can annotate that segment has that term in it. We can annotate it with a very high degree of confidence. We say, this is really a validated term. It comes from Eurovoc. It's trustworthy, okay? So we think that's a really well-identified term, and we trust the translation of it. But we may want to be opportunistic. So can we find more translations that we can feed into our machine translation engine? So we go to BabelNet and we find some definitions and we find some translations, but we're not quite sure of the quality of them. So we can annotate the text saying, okay, we think this might be this concept, and we think this might be a good translation of it, but we put it up there with a question mark. We do that annotation, we give that annotation a question mark, and we also say where we got it from. We got this from BabelNet rather than from Eurovoc. We can then put that information, even quite trivially into an MT engine, force the decoding of those terms, and then get a translation that might be a little bit better than if we hadn't told it anything about the terms, especially if there wasn't a lot of those terms occurring in our training data to start off with. Okay, so we'll get some translations. It probably makes sense, but within the context of this particular document, are those the right translations? And that's where you get back to the really critical point that you need to gather as much of the expertise of the linguist that you employ to do these translations. In this case, really doing post-editing. So we're talking about how much leverage we get from machine translation. So if we ask someone to post-edit it, they say, okay, the sentence looks great, but refrigerator isn't the right translation for chest freezer, so I'm going to put a different word in for that. The tense for microwave isn't right in this context because the morphology wasn't captured in the suggested translation that we got from BabelNet. So we can ask the post editor, and this is in Falcon what we do is instrument the tools that they use. So these are commercial CAT tools, commercial terminology management tools, to record these decisions that they make. They say, I know that this is a term, but the suggestion is wrong, and I'm correcting it in this way. They correct it, and then we feed it back into the term base. So actually, when we record all these, the interesting things is actually the links. It's the fact that the post editor is able to say, that initial translation isn't valid in this context or isn't appropriate in this context. Here's a translation that is better, okay? And perhaps the definition isn't quite right. He may also say, here's a better definition. So there's effort that the post editor puts into the process that is recorded, and is recorded as a link rather than necessarily as an attribute of the text. And this is potentially interesting perhaps from the legal point of view, because all the words and the sentences, and the terms and the sentences are all subject, even if there isn't a contract out defining who owns them, they will ultimately be subject to copyright. So when you translate someone's content, it can be regarded as a derivative work. So even if nothing else is stated, if you copyrighted the original, the person who wrote that still has some claim over the target. Whereas links, they're sort of database fields. Okay, they're not part of the contents. They're not necessarily copyrightable in the same way. Could potentially be protected under the database directive. Okay, from the EU. So we're making a little bit more explicit that there's a link there. We're saying who came up with that link, how reliable might they be, or who were they, what position are they in, and are they able to claim some ownership over that? And if those links are seen to add value, if we can feed back those corrections to terminology translations back into our machine translation engine, or back into our term base, which is then used by our machine translation engine. And then if we could monitor over time things like, is that machine translation improving, either through static comparative tests or through monitoring post-editing effort, effort, we can start attributing value, and we can trace that value back to the people who provided those corrections. So we start putting the mechanisms in place to allow us to see where people are generating value beyond just producing a translation in terms of linking translations and terms, and be able to give them that value back. So I think the good news on that is, having trying to sort of prototype and model this, we find we can do nearly all of this with existing models. We don't have to invent much new. So we use largely W3C vocabularies. I won't go through these in a lot of detail, but certainly ones that we've mentioned already: provenance, data catalog, a few other ones that are a little bit more technical involved. We tend to go for the lowest common denominator in terms of data format. So we're actually using comma-separated values, because one of the things we find is both engineers in the localization industry and actually people in language technology get scared by RDF, So this is still linked data, but we don't, we try and make it a little bit easier. And again, this is all standards coming from the W3C. It's still linked data. It all maps into RDF quite nicely, but it's done under the covers. So I think the good news is this is all very feasible. We're working with prototypes that integrate this with existing terminology management and translation management tools. We're using existing standards to extract information and map them into these linked data formats. So we transform from TBX and TBX, TMX, and XLIF to do this. So this is all very, very feasible with technology we have at the moment. Now we need to understand, how can we really manage this as a value chain?